came to Canadian literature through sort of non combination, I guess, of being an Americanist originally and then being taught by post-colonial specialists such as Shirley Chun and Annette Hunter, both of whom were pretty fundamental to the development of the study of Canadian literature in the UK. So partly through their influence, or very much through their influence, I became very engaged in Canadian literature. And what really engaged me was how were the politics, not only within the text we were studying, this is in sort of 1990-91, and the way that different writers were engaging with how to tell various complicated histories about Canada and its construction as a nation state. But also because my background at that time had come from a job in the book publishing industry, I was fascinated by the beauty of the books I was holding in my hand. In those days, Canadian government subsidies meant that small press publishers, from Anansi to a whole range of presses, some of which no longer exist, could produce extremely high quality material artifacts for a very low cover price. And so this fascinated me and really meant that my twin interests in, if you like, the politics of the text and political representation were really bound up with my questions about cultural production, the ways that texts circulate, and more recently in the ways that readers receive them and the uses that they make of them. So that's, I guess, my story. Like Pilar, I have a lot to thank my National Association for Canadian Studies for, because they were really my first community as a young scholar, but also they gave me people to talk to, so I very much identify with her narrative about that. The British Association is 40 years old next year, so it was fairly well established, very well established by the time I was fortunate enough to join it, and through the people who had made that association happen, I also got the chance to meet various Canadian writers and Canadian academics who were invited over, often with the support of Canadian money from DFAID. So in many senses, I am a product of DFAID, the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. I've benefited from it through the institutions and associations it's funded, through study tours that it's funded, through various kinds of grants for travel and research, and in the monies I've been able to apply for, which have enabled me to in turn invite writers and academics to the UK. I suppose to pick up on something Anne said, because I work in a program of American and Canadian studies, inevitably my students are being invited to approach Canadian literature through a national paradigm. That said, I think the way that we teach it is always to problematize that national paradigm in some of the ways that Anne outlined. They are usually very engaged again by the kinds of very contemporary topical political issues that Canadian writers raise, issues around sort of asylum, hospitality, notions of citizenship, critiques of multiculturalism. But they, to be honest, I think they also enjoy at the level of sheer pleasure discovering writers that they just haven't been exposed to before, that they haven't encountered before, and discovering that there is a world of Canadian writing outside of Margaret Atwood, which, certainly as a European, you can certainly sometimes be forgiven for thinking that there is nothing beyond Margaret Atwood. So that's kind of a personal story. I don't know if Julie wanted to say something about hers.
Okay, so I was supposed to run the slides and not say very much, so I promised not to say a lot. It isn't my place to say anything a lot. First of all, I want to acknowledge whose land we're on, which is the land of the Six Nations people, most particularly the Mohawk people, the Uwai, the people who live here. We are their guests. Lucky us. It's not a lot. So I wish to acknowledge that. I went to McMaster University as an undergraduate in the 1980s. It was a long time ago. I studied Canadian literature because I am an American originally, and when I migrated to Canada, I did not understand where I was. I am an invisible immigrant. It is hard for you maybe to hear the way that I used to talk and the way that I still can think. I'm a little too noisy to be a good white Canadian. A little bit. And I was curious about where I landed. I went to the public library when I was 13 to try to read the books that people produced here so that I could understand where I was. I suspect that a good many of you have done the same thing when you come to Canada, to understand where you are and how complicated that is. So I retained my interest in Canadian literature, but really Canadian cultural studies, especially nonfiction, what ordinary people do, and now graphic autobiography and memoir. Those are the things that I'm interested in. Today, and for the rest of this time, I am very proud to be able to be the co-writer of the paper I did with Danielle, which is about Canada Reads in the non-fictional year, in which it appeared really a non-fictional expert on that, but also I bring to that interest that I have in book history and media studies so that we can think about Canada not just as a place of literary production, but as a place of cultural production and industrial production, especially in the times in which we live. I think it's very important to understand how those things work. So thank you for having me. I consider myself to be a background guest because I'm not part of the Understanding Canada Consortium. Thank you for having me.